Here's a question that sounds embarrassingly simple, but gets weird fast the moment you actually pull on it. Did ancient humans fall in love? Not pair up for survival, not tolerate each other inside a cave. Actually fall in love. The heart racing. Can't stop thinking about them. I would genuinely do something stupid for this person kind. Because most of us just assume yes, obviously, love is ancient, love is human, love is basically eternal. But then you ask, how do we actually know that? And the answer turns out to be one of the most surprisingly moving things in all of science. You're a Homo sapiens, somewhere in what will eventually be called Europe or Africa. It's roughly 50,000 years ago. There is no wedding industry. There is no Valentine's Day. There are no romantic comedies to tell you how you're supposed to feel. There is no word for relationship status. There isn't even really a word for anything yet in the way we understand language. There is just you, a small band of maybe 20 or 30 people you've known your entire life, a fire that might go out, predators that very much want to eat you, and, apparently, feelings. Complicated, inconvenient, evolutionarily baffling feelings. For a long time, the scientific consensus was pretty cold about this. The idea was essentially, ancient humans paired up because it was useful. You need someone to help raise offspring that take an absurdly long time to become independent. Seriously, a baby wildebeest can run within minutes of being born, and human children are basically useless for years. So the theory was that pair bonding was just a reproductive strategy, a deal. You stay, I stay, the kids don't die, everybody wins. Love, by this reading, was just evolution dressing up a contract in pretty feelings, so we'd actually follow through on it. Efficient. Cold. Honestly, a little depressing. But here's the problem with that cold, transactional view. If love is just a thin evolutionary costume over a survival contract, why does it hurt so much when it ends? Why do humans, across every single culture ever studied, write poetry about it, sing about it, die for it, and do genuinely irrational things in its name? Why does rejection of a romantic partner light up the exact same regions of your brain as physical pain? You can give a wildebeest a contract. You cannot give a wildebeest a broken heart. That gap between what's useful and what's actually happening inside human brains is exactly where this story gets interesting. Modern neuroscience has mapped what romantic love actually looks like in the brain, and the results are genuinely strange. When you are in love, early, intense, can't-eat romantic love, your brain behaves almost identically to someone on cocaine. The reward pathways flood with dopamine. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thinking, quietly dims. Your attention narrows to one specific person. You feel euphoric and anxious at the same time. This system is old. Not invented in the Victorian era old. Not a few thousand years ago old. This neural architecture is shared with animals who haven't changed much in millions of years. We're talking ancient wiring. The hardware predates us. Now here's where it stops being theory and starts being evidence you can actually look at. Archaeologists have found burial sites from tens of thousands of years ago that are almost impossible to explain through pure survival logic. At a site in Sungheir, Russia, 34,000 years old, they found a man buried with thousands of hand-carved ivory beads carefully arranged on his body, red ochre powder dusted over him, and a fox-tooth pendant. Not just buried, decorated, honored, mourned, and then nearby, two children buried head-to-head, covered in the same painstaking detail. Someone spent enormous amounts of time on these burials. You do not do that for a contract. You do that because you felt something. Red ochre specifically keeps showing up, and it matters. It's a pigment, essentially ancient paint, and it has been found at burial sites stretching back 100,000 years or more. In South Africa, at Skull Cave, ancient humans were buried with red ochre and shell beads long before anyone would have expected symbolic behavior. Red ochre takes effort to find, grind, and apply. It has no nutritional value. It doesn't make you warmer. It does not help you outrun a predator. The only reason to cover a dead person in red pigment is symbolic. It means this person mattered to us. This person was not just useful. We are marking their departure from the world as something significant. That is grief. And grief, the real kind, only comes from love. So if love is ancient wiring, here's the part that trips people up. Why does it hurt so spectacularly when it ends? From a pure efficiency standpoint, heartbreak is a disaster. You can't focus. You can't eat properly. You lie around staring at nothing. Ancient humans couldn't really afford to do that. There were things trying to eat them. So evolutionary biologists have a fascinating answer. The pain of loss is the other side of the bond. The brain creates enormous attachment specifically because losing that person needs to feel catastrophic. Because in a small, ancient band of 20 people, losing a partner or close companion could genuinely be catastrophic. The hurt is the system working correctly. The grief is proportional to the love. Here's something that often gets lost in these conversations. Scientists have identified that love is actually at least 3 separate brain systems, and they evolved at different times for different reasons. There's lust, pure raw attraction, driven by testosterone and estrogen, ancient and shared with almost every mammal on the planet. Then there's romantic love, the obsessive, laser-focused attachment we've been talking about, driven by dopamine. And then there's long-term attachment, the calm, deep bond, driven by oxytocin and vasopressin, the one that makes you feel at home near someone after years together. Ancient humans had all 3. And here's the kicker. They can fire independently, which is probably why human relationships have always been, shall we say, complicated. Let's talk about something else that points to real emotional depth: prehistoric art and music. The oldest known musical instruments, bone flutes, carved from vulture and mammoth bone, date back at least 40,000 years. Music, at its deepest evolutionary level, is about emotional communication and social bonding. And the cave paintings, not just the famous Lascaux horses, but the smaller, quieter ones, sometimes show figures that appear to be together, deliberately placed together. There's a famous carved figurine called the Venus of Hohl Fels, 40,000 years old, which some researchers interpret as a fertility symbol, but others see as a love token, something carried, held, treasured. Objects kept close to the body across thousands of miles of a life. There's another category of evidence archaeologists rarely talk about in public, but it's arguably the most emotionally raw. Skeletons that show signs of long-term caregiving. A Neanderthal found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, aged, arthritic, missing one arm, partially blind, had survived for years in this condition. He could not have hunted. He could not have gathered effectively. He was, by pure survival logic, a burden on the group. And yet someone fed him. Someone kept him alive. For years. Now you could argue that was purely social duty. But keeping a non-productive elder alive for years in a world where every calorie counts is not a cold calculation. That is something that looks a lot like love. Here's a question that's harder to answer with fossils. Did ancient humans pine? Did they feel longing? That specific ache of missing someone, not because they were dead, but because they were just somewhere else. The best evidence comes from what we know about ancient mobility. Hunter-gatherer bands split and merged constantly. People were separated by hunting trips, by seasonal migrations, by conflict. And we know from anthropology that modern hunter-gatherer societies have rich emotional lives around absence. They remember. They anticipate return. They grieve separation. Given that their brains were identical to ours, and given that the attachment system we described is specifically designed to make separation feel urgent, the answer is almost certainly yes. Ancient humans sat on a hill somewhere and missed someone. Anthropologist Helen Fisher spent decades studying romantic love across cultures, and what she found essentially closes the case. Romantic love, not arranged partnership, not sexual attraction, But the obsessive-focused attachment phase has been documented in 147 different cultures across every continent. It shows up in the oral histories of isolated tribes. It shows up in medieval manuscripts from a dozen civilizations independently. It shows up in songs recorded from cultures that had never met. The specific language changes. The rituals change. But the experience, the sleeplessness, the obsessive thinking, the euphoria, the specific terror of being rejected, maps almost exactly every time. Something that universal isn't a cultural invention. It's biology. It's ancient. Now, to be fair to the skeptics, and I think this is worth sitting with, some historians and anthropologists do argue that romantic love as a cultural ideal is historically recent. The idea that you should marry someone because you're in love with them is, in many parts of the world, genuinely a modern concept. For most of recorded history, marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement. The Greeks had separate words for different kinds of love and weren't convinced romantic love was something to be trusted. The medieval concept of courtly love was more about longing from a safe distance than anything we'd call a relationship. So the argument goes, the feeling might be ancient, but the story we build around it, the expectation, the primacy of it, that part is newer. But here's the distinction that I think resolves this really cleanly. There is a difference between the raw feeling of romantic love, the neurology, the attachment, the biochemistry, and the cultural story we build on top of it. The feeling is ancient. The story, the expectation that one person should be your everything, the notion of a soulmate, the idea that romantic love is the highest form of human connection, that story has changed enormously across time and culture. Ancient humans almost certainly experienced the flood of dopamine, the specific attachment to one person, the grief of losing them. But they didn't have the narrative we layered over it. They felt it without a framework for it, which honestly might have been its own kind of clarity. There's one more piece of evidence I want to leave you with. At a site in the Czech Republic, archaeologists found a small, carved figurine, human-shaped, carefully made, placed in a grave dating back around 29,000 years. It was positioned as if someone had deliberately held it against the body, and nearby, analysis suggested the grave occupant had lived with a disability that would have required significant care. Two people, dependent on each other, one dying first, the other, or someone else who loved them, placing a tiny carved figure in the earth with them. We'll never know what they felt. We can't hear what was said over that grave. But someone made something small and beautiful and chose to send it into the earth with a person they couldn't keep. So here's what I think the answer actually is. Ancient humans fell in love, not as a performance, not as a cultural script, but in the raw, neurochemical, I would spend 30 hours making ivory beads for your grave sense. The feeling existed before the poetry did. It existed before the word for it. It was firing in human brains before humans had the vocabulary to describe it. Which means at some point, a long time ago, someone felt something enormous and had absolutely no way to explain it and just had to sit with it. And that's both a little heartbreaking and, honestly, kind of beautiful. Because it means when you feel something for someone and can't quite find the words, you are doing exactly what your ancestors did. You are extremely, inconveniently, ancient brain human. The story we tell about love has changed 1,000 times. The ideal has shifted. The rituals have evolved. The vocabulary has ballooned into something our ancestors would find baffling and excessive. But underneath all of it, underneath the Valentine's cards and the rom-coms and the elaborate proposals, there is the same ancient brain doing the same ancient thing it has always done, flooding with dopamine, narrowing its attention to one specific person, feeling the absolute catastrophe of loss. And somewhere, 30,000 years ago, someone stayed up all night carving tiny beads by firelight for a person they loved. I don't know about you, but I think that's one of the most human things I've ever heard. If this rewired something for you, follow as Preston Explains. There's a new one every day.